On the Block with Andrew Garbage, a podcast about authentic people doing beautiful things. Enjoy the show.
I was reading an article recently about a concept called benign masochism. It was a term coined by a PhD professor emeritus of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, a guy by the name of Paul Rozin. And it describes basically how humans enjoy negative sensations and emotions when they can be reassured that no actual harm will come to them, a safe threat, so to speak. It was in a National Geographic blog piece, if you want to check it out. If you smell some bad milk or taste something that's a little off and you go, oh God, smell this, or appeal to things like roller coasters or scary rides or really, really spicy foods or, crazy, painful Thai massage, right? The benign masochism, this exhilaration that we get from getting close to the flame, but unlike Icarus, not getting too close. The reason I bring this up, other than the fact that I find this fascinating about human behavior, is that for a very long time, going all the way back to Aristotle, in a formal sense, but I think even much, much before this in our human understanding of story, this has been one of the reasons why people go to narrative, why people tell stories and consume stories, is because through stories, Aristotle said that drama can allow people this vehicle to purge emotions of pity and fear. Pity and fear, and in his case, pity, I think, would extend to human empathy as well. It allows us to feel for another and put ourselves in the place of another and wonder what we would do in similar situations, or to be exhilarated by a concept of fear, right? To see something horrific happening. This is why people watch horror movies, right? But not really horrific, right? You know that you're playing at this, and it's alluring for some reason. Our guest this week is somebody, I think, who has played with this a little bit. Pam Houston is the guest on the program this week. She's not someone who writes things that are overblown and horrific and drastic. She is a master of the subtle, but I think in her writing, one finds the ability to purge all sorts of emotions, of jealousy, of shame, of lust, of curiosity, of anger, all the kinds of things that constitute a human life. Pam came a couple of years ago to speak at the school where I teach as a part of our Mouths of Others series, and I got to interview her during that time, and we're going to play that interview for you here today on the Block Radio. I pinch myself still when I get to sit with these people who have become masters of their craft. I was just speaking with former guest of the show and longtime friend, Dami Shoemaker, the other day, and Dami was saying, oh my gosh, you guys have such wonderful people on. And I was saying, yeah, we do, by the way, including you, Dami. And that just continues into the foreseeable future. And it goes right up to Pam being on this week. We're stepping into our first post-year-old episode and are still, I hate to sound like a broken record, but we're blown away at the caliber of folks we get to come sit with us on the show. And the rest of the fall lineup is going to accordingly show you that exact thing. Pam is a master of her craft, a wonderful writer, a wonderful teacher. And I did this interview early on in my quote unquote career as an interviewer. And, I remember being terrified in these interviews because, this all came about from me sitting with the group of folks, the committee that puts these readings on at my college, and saying, hey, we have this world-class radio studio here, along with producer Mike DiNapoli, who was a student there at the time. It's probably his idea, actually, originally. Why don't we interview some of these authors while they're here? It was his idea, but I took it to the committee and have them go along with the readings. And the committee said, hey, that's a great idea. Why don't you do it, Gurvich? And this is one of those careful what you wish for things, because, in one hand, I've always wanted to do this, like I always talk about here. and jumped at the chance. But on the other hand, I was like, wow, I'm going to cut my teeth on a microphone interviewing people with National Book Award and Pushcart Prize and who've been in Best American Short Stories. And, I'm going right to the front of the line in terms of interviewing some folks who have devoted their lives to mastery of a craft. And so sitting with Pam, as accessible and kind, generous, and open as she is, there's a kind of awe that I had, at least, in being around somebody who is that good at what they do. Her most recent book is called Contents May Have Shifted. It came out in 2012. She's also the author of 2 collections of linked short stories, Cowboys Are My Weakness, which is the one that put her on the map, and Waltzing the Cat. The author of the novel Hound, and also a collection of essays, A Little More About Me, all published by Norton Press. As I said a second ago, her stories have been selected for volumes in Best American Short Stories, the O. Henry Awards, 2013 Pushcart Prize, and Best American Short Stories of the Century. She is the winner of the Western States Book Award, the WILLA Award for Contemporary Fiction, the Evil Companions Literary Award, I love that title, and multiple teaching awards. She directs a literary nonprofit, Writing by Writers, and is professor of English at UC Davis. She teaches at the Institute of American Indian Arts Low-Rez MFA program and at writers' conferences all around the world. Pam also lives on a at a ranch at 9,000 feet in Colorado near the headwaters of the Rio Grande. And if you follow her on Facebook, she's always posting these really captivating meditations on the land and on her connection to it and on how she really only feels sane when she's on that land. Very indigenous quality to her in that sense, and also her love affair with her animals, her beloved dogs, over the years. And so a very complex person, a very interesting person. One of the things that I loved about our interview, 2 things actually, is she's a synesthete. Maybe not officially, but that Pam, we talk about that she sees frequently shapes in her head, and then tries to make a story that fits that shape. She'll see some geometric figure in her brain and then write a series of linked short stories that sort of, in some conceptual way to her, fills out that shape. And so her stories are about characters, but they're always about place, and they have very, very profound and interesting and subtle linkages, some of which are not so obvious when we just go to our, character, plot, setting kinds of things and our traditional understanding of story, but move over into these abstract, geometric, conceptual frames as well. And it's fascinating to hear her speak about that, talk about a Dr. Seuss alphabet that was an inspiration for her early on. And again, this kind of direct connection between letters and the shape of the letter and its sound and its meaning. Very fascinating stuff. The other amazing thing that Pam discusses, and she's not the only one, friend of the show, friend of ours, and just all-around badass, Lydia Yuknovich talks about this as well. Pam is not interested in this wall that we have between fiction and nonfiction. I've always found this to be rather profound as a professor and even as a student. When you go to the library, the 2 main divisions, right, the way the library is divided into these 2 categories. We have fiction, which is, I guess, things that we know we've made up. And then we have non-fiction, which is a very flimsy category if you think about it. It's not fiction in fact. It's not fiction in truth. It's not fiction and rationality. It's fiction and not fiction. So the big division in the library, in the place where we, the great storehouses of human knowledge are, here are the things that we know we've made up on purpose. And over here are the things that we haven't made up on purpose. They still might be fabricated. They still most likely are fabricated. And through the years, right, we can see, especially at the edges, how things bleed from one category to another. When an author sits down to write a short story or a novel, Pam will put a character in one of her stories named Pam. And then everyone goes, oh, well, that's her. Right, so they'll make 2 classic mistakes. They'll say everything that character does is simply something that Pam Houston has done in her life. And so this is just autobiographical. And then the second mistake we make is that every other character in the story is not Pam. Right, and she speaks to this regularly, that of course she is every character in the story, and at the same time she is none. Some of these things bleed over from things that she's actually experienced in her life. Some emerge from things that she's read or seen other people experience. And every piece of nonfiction is fictionalized, in that it is a creation of the mind of its author. And every piece of fiction has a profound element of truth and fact to it, because it can all be traced back at some point to someone's actual lived experience in the world. And so I love that authors like Pam Houston, Lydia Yuknavitch, and others are blowing apart these categories on what a narrative is. They're blowing apart linearity. They're blowing apart character. They're blowing apart our expectations on what a woman writer is. They're blowing apart these walls between fiction and nonfiction. And so it's an exciting time to be a reader. It's an exciting time to be a writer, because we're starting to realize that the only rules really are the ones that we set upon ourselves as we go out into this vast ocean of knowledge and experience and try to understand it and communicate it back to ourselves. So it was a real honor to speak with Pam, and I know you're going to enjoy this episode. All right, folks, Pam Houston, the amazing author, coming at you on the Block Radio. This is your host, Andy Gurvich, and we will see you on the other side.
My dad is a working man. He's lived for a long life, providing for his family. My mom was a working woman. She worked her hands to the bone, to the grave, to meet our ends. And as long as more seeds sprout and
grow. Whether I'm writing something that's called an essay, something that's called a novel, something that's called a short story, something that's called a play, something that's, I guess that's pretty much all I write, right? But essentially something that's called fiction or nonfiction, I do the same thing. I cast around in my what I have noticed lately file, and I bring, unlike chunks of the physical world together into proximity and see if by bringing them together they make something greater than the sum of their parts. And I don't pay much attention to whether it really happened or not. Like, for me, the difference between fiction and nonfiction is really all about narrative stance. It's not about whether it happened or not. When I'm writing nonfiction, I allow myself a certain amount of retrospective knowledge and a certain particular kind of overview. And in fiction, I try to be as naive as I possibly can going into the writing process. And really, that's the difference for me. But I choose my details from the world, and then I shape it into a form. And sometimes that form is fiction, and sometimes it's nonfiction, and sometimes it's a novel, and sometimes it's a short story, sometimes it's a play. But I mean, I wish I'm afraid I sound like I'm being evasive, and I'm not being evasive, or I'm not trying to be evasive. Everything I write about is something that I have experienced either at the center of it or on the periphery, and then it gets shaped. And somewhere in that process, characters emerge sometimes, or they don't, and then it's an essay. I don't make anything like a hard and fast distinction between the two things. If the world didn't call it nonfiction and fiction, it would be fine with me. It would not rattle my process at all if we all of a sudden abolished those two categories. And I realize when I say that in a room full of journalists or whatever, they get very upset. I realize that there are people whose job it is to report the way it really happened, and that they feel it's very important that people, maintain some integrity in that regard. But I'm not that person. I'm not hired to report what really happened. So, and my belief system is that even if I tried really, really hard to report what really happened, language wouldn't let me, because, language shifts. Language won't stand still. That's why we love it. And even if I really tried to make everything up, I don't even know what that would mean. I can't even imagine what that would be. I can't even imagine it. Like total, pure invention, I can't imagine it. Because even if I were going to set a book, in the future, there'd still be a peanut butter sandwich, and I know what one tastes like. You know what I mean? So I've never really been able to sort out the difference. And I'm kind of comfortable there. I'm comfortable floating in the space between. I like the freedom to make things up that fiction affords me. If the story asks for it. But all my fiction begins in the same place as my nonfiction, in my actual experience. Again, whether I'm at the center of that experience or whether I'm on the periphery observing it.
Hi, this is Garth Greenwell. I'm the author of What Belongs to You, and you're listening to On the Block Radio.
Well, I was an only child in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, to much older parents, and I spent almost my whole childhood at the Bethlehem Public Library, reading books that were older than my age group. And I guess just hanging out there. I spent years, literally years, junior high, high school, at the Bethlehem Public Library. Well, again, my parents weren't big readers, and we had I think one old chewed-on copy of The Valley of the Dolls in our guest room or something, which I read, of course, when I was 10. But so libraries entirely influenced, it entirely created my love of reading, and in particular, the Bethlehem Public Library. I had a fantastic babysitter named Martha Washington who taught me how to read by paying me a nickel to read a road sign or a cereal box or a milk carton. So I actually could read when I was 3 and a half. I read very early, and so right then my parents started dropping me off at the library, and I think I probably read every book in the children's and young adult and eventually literature section of that library before I graduated from high school. My father wanted me to be a tennis player, like Chris Everett. He actually wished that I were Chris Everett. And my mother wanted me to be an actress. She was an actress. And I do have a teeny bit, not so much today, but I have a teeny bit of the comic timing that made her think, and that's helped my writing. But no, they were very surprised and somewhat alarmed by my decision to become a writer. Well, I teach at the University of California, Davis, and that gives me access to the whole UC Davis library system, which has kind of become my main library hangout these days. Although there's certain libraries that I love, particular little libraries, like the very, very beautiful library in Basalt, Colorado is just a wonderful place to sit and read. And also, a town I used to live in, Winter Park, Colorado, has a great little library that was funded, and I love this story, by two of the most eligible people in town who had both sworn to never get married, got married to raise money to open this beautiful library in Fraser, Colorado, which is a very small town. But these two people, Annie von Drasek and David Abramoff, got married, and everyone donated tons of money to see that actually happen, the wedding, and they were able to open a lovely library where I've read in Fraser. I haven't thought in particular about library budget cuts, but in general, being part of the UC system, I'm up against budget cuts for literature and the arts constantly, and I think it's a sign of everything that's wrong with our culture. I mean, I fear what will happen when there's no money for books and art in general, and we seem to be heading that way. And I mean, honestly, to me, it seems like we're tumbling over this waterfall that we'll never come back from. I think it's awful. Yes, I mean, I'm lucky to live in California. I'm lucky to teach in California and live in Colorado, and for us, censorship is not an issue in either of those places that I'm aware of. It's possible it's creeping into Colorado from neighboring states, but I don't know of it, if that's true. And because I teach in California, we don't have that problem there. But I mean, I can't say anything that hasn't been said better somewhere else, but it's appalling. It's absolutely appalling that, there was a time when Cowboys first came out, my first book, Cowboys Are My Weakness, and there were I got some hate mail. I got a lot of hate mail. And, the suggestion was I wasn't a good enough feminist because I wrote this book that had these bad boyfriends in it. And, at the time I said, what is feminism? What is feminism except every woman's right to tell her own story? And what is freedom except every person's right to tell their own story? And so I think it's so horrendous as to be almost inconceivable. Well, I'm sort of waiting for one. The book that's about to come out is called Contents May Have Shifted. It goes all over the world, tries to learn some things from other people in the world. It's almost kind of a photo album of all these different snapshots of the narrator who goes around trying to figure out how to live a bigger life by learning from other people and places. So that's one reason I'm against censorship. But that's what this new book is. But of course, now that this book is sitting here on the table, I need a new project, and I honestly, I'm fishing around. I went to Mongolia. I have to write a big article about that trip. It was an amazing trip. I just wrote a piece about alcoholism, having alcoholics as parents for an anthology, but I'm mostly just writing shorter pieces while I figure out what my next big project is.
All right. Our guest today is author Pam Houston. Pam is the author of 2 collections of linked short stories, Cowboys Are My Weakness, Waltzing the Cat, also the novels Sight Hound and Contents May Have Shifted, and also a collection of essays called A Little More About Me. Her stories have been selected for volumes of Best American Short Stories, the O. Henry Awards, the Pushcart Prize, and Best American Short Stories of the Century. My name is Professor Andy Gurvich, and for the next half hour or so, Pam and I will be in a conversation about her reading here at Mount Hood Community College and other events that she has going on and the writing process itself. Pam, welcome to Mount Hood.
Thank you very much.
We just got back from our reading. We had about 100 people there. I wanted to commend you on it. It was a fabulous reading. We really enjoyed it. I want to jump right into it because we'll have a little bit of time. In my show prep, like I told you on the way up here, I was a little nervous to interview, so I did a lot of prep and watched and read a lot of interviews. And, I saw people that asked you what I would call good questions, and I saw some questions that I found kind of maddening, either just amateur or downright offensive in certain ways. Things like, how do you write your male characters? Or, is the Pam in the book the real Pam? Or what's the difference between fiction and nonfiction? Asking you to talk about your role as a woman writer and these kinds of things. And I was wondering, maybe if we can start the conversation with, especially because your writing tends to cross so many different boundaries, if we could start the conversation with you talking a little bit about your thought about the efficacy of labels kind of for modern writers, both for yourself and for writing students.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not very easily offended, quite honestly. And I'm always worried about offending other people. So, so I don't really find questions like that offensive as much as, sometimes unanswerable or, like you say, pigeonholing or something. I've always been hesitant to speak for any group, whether it's women writers or Western women writers or writers who write in the first person or Western women writers who are from New Jersey. I don't, for me, I'd always rather tell a story as a way to express my opinion, or I'd always rather speak for myself and from my own experience. I don't... in interviews, I'm always just trying to tell the truth, and sometimes people don't want to hear the truth, sometimes people want to hear whatever supports their party line, and that's when I get into trouble in interviews, because if I feel somebody wanting me to have a certain opinion about, I was on, a panel up at AWP about women and travel writing, and we were all supposed to say, women who write travel have it so much harder than men, and we get such a raw deal, and I don't feel that way. I mean, I feel in certain ways it's easier for women to travel because they're not threatening, they can get themselves into more situations sometimes than men who there might be more resistance to. And I'm sure there's downsides. But anyway, so I'm not a party line tower. And anyone who's trying to get me to toe a party line, I tend to resist even more than I necessarily believe. But other than that, I'm happy to answer a lot of different kinds of questions as long as they don't already, as long as the answer isn't in some way preordained.
What about this idea of labeling, your own writing or that of others? I mean, when you're when you're dealing with genre and we're dealing with authors or yourself or someone else, there's the question of where do you put the book on the shelf. But how do you handle it as a writer? Are you a memoirist? Are you a nonfiction writer? Are you a novelist?
I'm squarely in the middle of that by choice. I mean, my recent book, Contents May Have Shifted, it is. It says it's a novel right on the cover. There's a little cloud with a word "novel" in it, and yet it's in 144 distinct pieces that do not necessarily follow one to the next. For me, it's kind of a geometry puzzle of a book. It's kind of a Rubik's Cube of a book. There's 12 sets of 12, et cetera, et cetera. Writers always think about their work differently than the reader does. And so for me, it's kind of a geometric problem, that book. But also, probably most significantly, I made the decision to call the main character Pam, which coincidentally is my name. Yeah. And so I was on purpose defying the genre line. I was saying, okay, I'm not so sure that we can draw this hard and fast line right down the middle between fiction and nonfiction, or fiction and memoir, or whatever two categories you want to put on either side of that line. And of course, I'm not the first person to say so. David Shields, John DeGatta, etc. But this was sort of my contribution to this conversation, saying, okay, this is my story, and it matters that it's my story. And so I'm going to call my narrator Pam to indicate that, or to kind of pay homage to that. On the other hand, I feel like my whole role in the world as an artist, what I'm doing as an artist, is to go out in the world, pay really strict attention to what I see and experience, bring it back to the page, and shape it into story. And sometimes in that shaping, it changes. And because I'm more interested in the artistry of the object that's produced than I am in representing something we might or might not agree is called reality. So for me, the fiction-y part of that tale is really important. I want license to make things up because that's what happens when I shape it. But I also want to be able to say, well, this is essentially my story. It's a bunch of things that happened to me brought together on the page and shaped into something artistic.
Yeah. I mean, so in one sense, every character in the book is you, not just the one named Pam. And in another sense, none of them are directly.
That's exactly right.
I heard you once talk about your writing saying that it's you keep a journal of things you notice.
Right.
And I think this is exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's right. That's where all my work comes from. I have this way of moving through the world, and I say well, a lot of us, I don't mean that I am unique in this in any way, but for me, the writing process begins when I'm out in the world noticing things that I call them glimmers. They go, hey, over here, writer, look, listen, pay attention to this. And I feel a kind of resonance with those things. And that feeling of resonance, which is almost a physical feeling, more than an intellectual one, makes me know that thing, whatever it is, that moment or that scene or that way the light is coming through the trees or the thing that the mother said to the kid in the aisle of the grocery store, whatever it is, I can bring it home and I can use it in some way in combination with some yet unknown other group of glimmers, and we'll be able to make a story out of it.
You said something in the question and answer period downstairs that really affected me. A student asked you something about your process, and and if you wrote every day, and you were talking about how you didn't. And in that answer, you talked about writing is about overcoming a certain amount of fear, and that when you can sit down at the screen and overcome that fear, then you go into the process. And there's times when you can't.
Right.
Another author that's a local author, I'm sure you know Tom Spanbauer.
Sure.
We just went to a reading of his recently, and he was reading from his new book. And Tom said because of his childhood and because of the abuse and things he had suffered, being told as a child that to be seen and not heard, and that his voice didn't matter, that every word that he writes is an act of courage.
Right.
And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Well, I
think own process and
I think every word that everyone writes, is an act of courage. Whether or not they were abused. I mean, I know he was, because he talks about it, and I think that probably makes it a particular kind of bad. But it's always bad to reveal yourself. It's always bad to take the risk of saying, okay, here's something awful about me. Are you going to like me anyway? Which is essentially what writers are doing all the time. But for me, it's kind of twofold, and I think for many people, I'm afraid of revealing, on one level, I'm afraid of not only revealing something about myself that might make me seem awful, but also of learning something about myself, which often happens in the writing process. You know, you write towards something and then you realize, oh, wow, I didn't even know it was that bad, you know. And then additionally, I'm afraid of writing badly, you know. I'm really afraid of writing badly. Like, I think writers spend so much time saying, no, you're okay, you're good, it's all right, you can still write, you haven't lost it, you know, this stupid self-talk that takes up so much brain space. And I am often afraid, well, if I'm not on today, then I'm going to have this crisis of confidence, just aside from all the personal or emotional stuff, like whether I'm still a good artist or whether I've forgotten how to do it. Or so I think, you know, the fear of sucking, you know, is really in there too. You know,
somebody asked you a question on there about, is teaching writing, has that changed your writing? But I wanted to ask you about it the other direction. You know, being a writer, I know for myself that once I started publishing nonfiction pieces a couple of years ago, my ability to teach writing changed, and it got a lot better, because once I got into the process and the struggle and the fear and the elation and the self-doubt, and once I got into that struggle with my students in real time, that I was just able to lead them through the experience in a much more authentic way. And so I'm wondering, I guess a twofold question, do you find that true for yourself also? And or maybe answer that one first, and then I'll ask you.
Well, I mean, I was lucky enough to be published really early, you know, while I was still in grad school, and that was also my first teaching experience. So I've never really done any teaching before I had kind of committed to pursuing publication and being a writer. I mean, I do know that my students, especially now that, you know, I'm this far in my career, I'm 50 years old, I'm 52 years old, I have, you know, multiple books and all of this. People are shocked to hear me say, you know, I wake up every morning just like you, and I'm afraid I won't be able to do it today, you know.
Do they think you're just giving them the line like you're supposed to say that? I think
sometimes. I also tell them, and this really matters to me, I also tell them, you know, when they're like, oh, you know, I've sent this out 10 times and no one's taken it, and what I say to them is, you know, there's nothing better than writing, you know, like there's many wonderful things about being published, and there's many wonderful things about having your book bought for enough money that you can take time off, or enough money that you can, you know, pay your rent or whatever. All those things are so gratifying, and I'm so grateful that I have them, that people pay me money to do this thing I love. It's tremendous. But none of that taken all together, no prize, Best American Short Stories of the Century, these things that I'm super grateful for, none of them feel as good as when you nail a paragraph. Yeah. Not one thing that can happen to you out in the actual world of publication and award giving and recognition will ever feel as good as when you're sitting there and you have this really tough scene to write, and you're just avoiding it, and then you sit down and you write it and you nail it. That's the best part. Amen and forever. There will never be anything, and they never believe me when I say that. But it's true.
Easy for you to say, right?
Exactly. But it's true. It's true. And nothing I say or don't say will make it untrue.
Right. I saw you say once that, and I wanted to ask you a couple things about this, that you never wrote originally to get published in the first place, that you wrote to save your own life. And I wanted to know a little bit about what you meant by that, but I also want to know if that's still the case, or more to the point, how do you avoid the trappings of not now with the career and with the persona and with the brand, and not sitting down to write a Pam Houston book, but to keep the art fresh and to not allow yourself to be pigeonholed? I heard you talk a little bit about it downstairs. But one way is with form, like I mentioned about contents may have shifted. Like for me, I set myself a different challenge with every book. So, and that usually is a formal challenge. In other words, you know, my book Hound, I wanted 12 different first-person narrators. That was a real formal challenge. So you see this first before any content?
I do.
You see an image?
I see. It's very physical. It's usually geometric in some way, or it's spirograph, or it's a bunch of slinkies and a knot, or it's... you know, Venn diagrams or
under the influence of any psychoactive plants?
No, not at all. Okay. Not at all.
That's
Quite
amazing.
the contrary. It's very mathematical. Yeah. And I really see form first. I had the opportunity to interview. Oh my God, I can't say his name. Oh, come on, Pam. Owen Meany.
Okay.
What's his name?
Forgetting it.
Not John Updike. The other really super famous guy. Thank you.
There you go.
There we go.
Push
Good
back
job.
button from the inside.
Good job. Okay. I had the opportunity to interview John Irving on stage a while back. And he said the stuff he always says about having this super duper outline where every single scene is delineated and he won't start a book until he knows the last sentence. And as he was sitting there telling me that, I thought, well, that's exactly the opposite. Because if I know where I'm going, if I know the arc of the story, if I know what's going to happen to the characters, I don't even want to tell it.
Yeah.
Like it's old news to me. But then I realized that this thing I do is kind of like what he does. Except for me, it's not, I know the scenes and I know the character arc and I know how it all resolves. What I know is that it's going to look like a Rubik's Cube with 12 sets of 12, and the relationships within the 12 are tighter than the relationships without the 12. I know a whole bunch of things too, and that's what makes it feel possible to go forward. But having said, the other half of your question is kind of about the brand and being Pam Houston and all that. The reality is, I have a mortgage just like everybody else, and I have to pay it, and so I need to be cognizant that this is how I make my living on the one hand. But on the other hand, I will make certain decisions for the money. Like I will write a 5,000-word piece for Oprah because I need a new roof, or whatever.
Redo the bathroom.
But the books, the big book projects, I try to keep separate from that. Had we called Contents May Have Shifted a memoir, which we could have with some adjustments, it would have sold a lot more copies because that's the moment we're living in, and I would have gotten paid more money for it, you know. But I didn't want it to be. Okay. I wanted it to be a novel because that's what it was. That's what it was in my mind. Not so much because I adjusted some things and shifted some things and but because of what I believe is the nature of fiction and the nature of fictional storytelling. Like, it happens to have been mostly true, but to me it was made like a work of fiction. So I didn't cash in on the memoir thing. Now I'm writing a memoir next. Because it's time. I should just try it. I should try to color within the lines and see how it goes, and so that's the new challenge. So that's the way to keep it fresh, to understand each book as a new formal or genre or emotional or artistic challenge. Having
written about, your parents, as you were saying, so much in your work, to now approach a memoir, is it going to be strange to put yourself into the confines of having to quote unquote tell the real story?
Well, the memoir is very specific. It's about my home. I bought a 120-acre ranch when I was just a little ninny from New Jersey who didn't understand that pipes froze. I came out to 9,000 feet and I bought a ranch when I was 30 years old. And had just sold my first book and had money, not a lot, but enough to put a down payment on this piece of property. And I bought a ranch and had no idea what I was doing. And so it's really about my process of learning that piece of land and learning how to care for it and all the crazy things I did wrong. And it ends with this massive fire that we had last summer that, it burned the whole mountain behind me and threatened to burn it down. So it's not about all that stuff.
Funny enough,
as I have found, some of that stuff works in no matter what I'm writing about. But it's really about my relationship to this piece of land. Do you have a geometric shape going for this book?
No,
so
not
far? Yet.
The two slinkies combined or something?
I've just been writing scenes. It does have an arc. Like, I know, of course, that it starts with this purchase. I was living in my lemon yellow Toyota Corolla and my VE 2410, and I went from living in that for 2 years to owning a 120-acre ranch. It was the first thing I've ever owned.
Alarming transition.
And it begins there and it ends with the fire, but I don't, but I need to, because that is the thing that will get me really excited to start organizing the material, is the form that I don't know yet.
Living near the mouth of a river is a really spiritual place to live. You know, people live near the mouth of the Ganges or other sacred rivers. They bathe there and cleanse there. It must be an amazing spot.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. It's right near the headwaters of the Rio Grande, and it's surrounded on 3 sides by 12,000-foot peaks. So
wow.
It's really beautiful.
Not a bad view in the morning.
It's really good.
How does somebody? I read in the notes that you were taught to read by Martha Washington.
Yes.
You look too young for that.
I know.
Tell us a little bit about this.
This was a different Martha Washington.
It's hard to not have a laugh track.
My mom was an older mother. I was her first child. She was. She lied about her age, but she was roughly. Let's say she was 42. And she was an actress and kind of a socialite and a party girl. And she was like, okay, had the baby. Now I want to go to the party. So on the bulletin board at the hospital was this ad for a babysitter. And they wrote the phone number down and called Martha Washington.
Wow.
And she was just a lady living in Trenton, New Jersey, which is where we were living. And she came to take care of me the first day I was out of the hospital, and she basically didn't leave until I was 22.
Wow.
She became my savior and my teacher. She taught me how to ride a bike. She taught me how to swim. She taught me how to read when I was about 2.5.
Wow.
You know, she was a supply sergeant in the Army. She was a little tough love, but she was very consistent.
You said she lived on several continents?
Yep, and she'd been all over the world in the Army.
Well, I'm wondering, when I hear this story, I'm wondering, because when I hear your background, I'm wondering how a person, as you said, with parents who weren't readers, you didn't have a lot of books in the house. How does this person become a person who devotes themselves to language? And I wonder about this Martha Washington character in 2 aspects. One, do you really think your hunger for literature as a way to connect with people started there?
That's a good question. I mean, she wanted me to do everything well. She was training me to survive my parents, sort of. And so, really, I mean, she taught me how to ride a bike young. She taught me how to swim young. I mean, I could swim like a fish when I was like 3. She wanted me to be competent at everything. Yeah. So she wasn't really a bookish person either. Both of my parents were terrific storytellers. My mother was a comedian, among other things. My father just had natural comic timing. So in a way, what I got from all those people was this idea that you ingratiate yourself to the world by telling a story, or but the actual literature part of it, it sort of seemed to come out of left field.
Really?
I did read a lot because I was alone a lot. But that was me figuring out the library or Martha taking me there.
Yeah.
But there weren't any literary types anywhere in the background.
When did you know you were going to be a person that devoted yourself to language? When did that really become clear to you? I mean, I don't know if you could pinpoint the day. Did it just sort of happen?
That's an interesting question. I don't know the answer. I mean, I do remember loving this book, On Beyond Zebra. I know I've talked about that other places, but this Dr. Seuss book, and some people don't know it, but it had 26 letters that came after Z, and it had all these creatures associated with those letters.
I have the alphabet right here.
There it is.
I was going to ask you about it.
That's so cool. Someone sent me a copy of the book a few years ago. That's so great. So it had all of these letters. I don't know, and that seems important. I mean, I just remember that, and I remember making things up, and but I can't tell you the answer to that. I remember reading The Modernists at a much later time, like in high school, and thinking, like, I remember reading Portrait of the Artist and thinking, oh, I get that, So I have to say, though, I had a good high school English teacher. I had wonderful professors in my undergraduate English professors, but I don't know. It never felt like dedicating myself to language. I guess that's why I can't answer your question.
Okay.
It felt like that movement of, like, going out in the physical world, loving the physical world, like so much. It was almost kind of heartbreaking. And then bringing that home and having to save it somehow. And then that led me naturally to language, you know. But it wasn't, I mean, I love language and I want my work to be languagey, you know. But that wasn't the driver. That was kind of the byproduct in a sense, early on.
When I looked this book up, because when you mentioned the Dr. Seuss book, and I'm glad you brought it up again because it was actually going to be my next question. I went and looked up these characters, and obviously we're doing a radio interview, but I recommend people listening go look up the alphabet for this book, On Beyond Zebra. And one of the things that hit me is that, you know, obviously these characters are very graphic and very geometric in a sense too. And
That's right.
I wonder if you're, you know, envisioning geometric figures to take you into the place of stories, kind of. Is connected to these characters.
Well, I think Dr. Seuss, I mean, I think he really affected my generation, perhaps many generations. And for me, like, if you look at those and you can see the names of the letters, the letters even resembled the characters that were born out. Like each letter had a creature. And not only did the letter look like it sounded, but it also, the creature looked sort of like the letter. And that relationship, I think that the imprinting of that relationship is really powerful for a young person's mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in a way it shows you, you know, when you look at you know, English that you've learned, you look immediately past the form to get to the content, but this pulls you back to the form.
Totally. I agree completely.
And maybe even shows you what's possible in places to take language into new areas.
Yeah. I should write a craft talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe I will.
Well, what's next for you? What's on the horizon? You mentioned the memoir.
The memoir, I read today some Maggie stories. I've got this character, Maggie, that is the way I avoid writing the memoir. I write another Maggie story. I am also writing, because I teach in the Pacific University Low-Rez program, and I'm asked to read a new craft talk every semester. I'm writing a series of craft talks, like one about dialogue, one about the second person, perhaps one about Dr. Seuss and his influence on me formally. So I'm having fun with that. So I have a lot of projects going. Nothing close to done at this moment.
What about, we're about wrapping up here, but just a little bit about some of the programs I know that you've been developing for writers who, for one reason or another, don't make it over to one of the low residency programs or the one at UC Davis, but some of these conferences that you set up for people that still want to have this intensive experience and feedback and mentoring.
Yeah.
I know you do a lot of this work, and I know they're really highly regarded.
I do, and it matters to me to make communities for writers of all kinds, you know, not just the ones who can commit to a longer term program at a university, but also people who just want to get together with other writers and talk about writing. And so I started a nonprofit called Writing by Writers with a friend of mine from Palo Alto named Karen Nelson, and we run a conference in Tamales Bay each year, which is north of San Francisco by about an hour, a wonderful conference in October every year. And we have added now a generative weekend in Boulder, Colorado. And I think for 2015, we're going to try to add a third and maybe stop there, or maybe add a fourth and see how that goes. But yeah, the idea behind all that is creating communities where writers can meet and get to know each other and work together, work with writers they admire for that short period of time, and then hopefully maintain community so they can, you know, send each other work and.
Have you been to the Whidbey Island Conference ever, the Women's Writers Conference?
I was at one point years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's like that. It's just a sort of another one of those. But we're trying to be movable so we can hit up different communities who might want to do it, and So it's a lot of fun, and it serves a different community than the university does, basically.
Well, Pam Houston, this has been a delight. Thank you so much for joining us and speaking today at Mount Hood Community College.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure to be here.
It's been great to have you. And audience, thank you for listening. Tune in next time, and we'll see you down the road.
Thank you for listening to On the Block Radio. Now go call your mother.
that introduction. There's still time to be a badass. I'm going to read, thank you to Lydia and everyone else that was involved in bringing me here. I'm delighted to be here. And I'm going to read two kind of different things today. I'm going to start out with a newer story, newer than Contents May Have Shifted, which I will also read a little bit from. This story is called Maggie on the Road, and it is told in the form of a triptych. In other words, there are 3 sections, and I think of them as panels. So there's 3 sections of 1,000 words each, and they rely on each other, but also possibly stand alone. And it's also a little bit unusual for me because it's in the 3rd person, and a lot of my writing is in the 1st or the 2nd person. So, I discovered, late in life, that the 3rd person can be fun. So I'm enjoying it, and I'm writing a lot of these Maggie stories. But anyway, this is one called Maggie. Buzzing. Maggie on the Road, and as I say, it's in 3 sections. And the first section is called Clear Air Turbulence. Got my cough drop. Okay. Clear Air Turbulence. It was a CRJ 300, the little jet, where even reasonably sized people spend the 2.5 hours between San Francisco and Tucson bumped up against each other at the shoulder, the elbow, and the knee. Maggie couldn't bring herself to do actual work in a space where she couldn't straighten her arms or legs, but once they reached their cruising altitude, she decided to distract herself by editing her Mongolia photos. The trip had been her 50th birthday present to herself, a lifelong dream, the temples, the steppes, Karakoram, the Gobi Desert. That her Mongolian guide was an undiagnosed borderline schizophrenic and such a compulsive liar that at one point Maggie became convinced that he was not even really Mongolian, was a small black mark on an otherwise satisfying trip. If he is not, in fact, an American misogynist, she wrote on several postcards of a yak-cow hybrid that the Mongolians delightfully call a kanag, which translates roughly to an every once in a while. He certainly came to the States to receive his training. But the physicality of the place was magnificent, the nomadic culture more or less intact, and Maggie had taken 3,000 photos in 21 days, which now sat in her hard drive, waiting to be futzed with. Her seatmate on the commuter plane had smiled so broadly at Maggie upon her arrival that Maggie thought they must be acquainted. Maggie was always bumping into former patients on airplanes, though not often, thank God, current ones. But this woman, who wore the aspect of a large, eager bird, an ostrich, Maggie thought, or a dodo, turned out to be simply friendly, the sort of friendly that made Maggie, and she hated to admit this, instantly suspicious. "Where's that?" the woman said, before Maggie had even selected her first thumbnail to enlarge. "Mongolia," Maggie said. "I was there for the whole month of July." "Mongolia," the woman said. "Incredible. I am so fascinated by Mongolia. I saw it, on The Amazing Race." Maggie didn't know The Amazing Race, but she got the gist of it. Another thing about 50, she thought, is that it was okay now to get the gist of things and leave it at that. TV was one of those. Systems analysis another. There were entire categories of professions, Maggie realized, where she had only the vaguest notion of what people actually did. Until only recently, when Maggie heard the words Silicon Valley, she didn't realize it referred to actual towns she knew the names of, San Mateo, San Carlos, Palo Alto, and had pictured instead a series of low-slung gray buildings nestled somewhere in the green hills of Santa Clara County, like Neverland or Santa's Workshop, buildings full of tiny people making things with very small tools. "Is that a temple?" the woman asked. "Gandanchelin Monastery," Maggie answered, "in Ulaanbaatar, one of the few the Russians left standing. Isn't that something? Beautiful, Maggie said, and very alive in there. Monks chanting in the different temples all hours of the day. Is that a cave painting of a deer? The woman pointed to another thumbnail. Ibex, I think, Maggie said. We saw some living ones, too. And so the miles fell under the wing of the plane, Maggie describing the Bronze Age petroglyphs at Babagan Nuru, the flaming cliffs at Obnob, the wild, short-legged and handsome Przewalski horses, descendants of an ancient breed. The woman's enthusiasm was nothing if not genuine, and eventually Maggie's mild irritation turned to an equally tepid gratitude. Really, had any of her friends been this excited to hear about her trip? The plane bounced sharply once without preamble. Clear air turbulence, she'd been told that was called. And look at this, Maggie said, a dinosaur spine, twice as long as I am, just laying on top of the sand. Really, the woman said, leaning hard over Maggie's arm to see the dun-colored calcified bones stretching like a long tail across the whiter, calcified soil. We drove for 3 days to get to this place, Maggie said, and then spines, femurs, you wouldn't have believed it. Vertebrae so large it took both hands to hold just one. It's all so hard to fathom. 39 million years. 39 million years, the woman said. And Maggie, hyper-vigilant as ever, missed neither the slight tonal change nor slight shift of the woman's energy back to her side of the skimpy armrest. 39 million years. Fucking shit, Maggie thought, her mind cornering hard to keep up with the conversation, not knowing the precise nature of blasphemy she had spoken, not knowing even really what her own side of the argument was. Where was Jonathan, her recovering Southern Baptist sometimes boyfriend, when she needed him? It would make his whole week to take a piece out of this woman's hide. Well, Maggie mumbled, that's what the guide said. The woman sniffed. She actually sniffed, thought Maggie, like somebody in a Henry James novel. So what is it that you think exactly, the woman said. Those dinosaurs just whirled up out of the dust? You had to marvel at the transformation. The woman's eyes, which had been just a few minutes before so bright and interested, were angry slits now, registering nothing but condemnation. The mouth aged a full 10 years. You should see your face right now, Maggie thought, but said, didn't they crawl out of the ocean? She realized she had not the slightest idea when people like this woman thought it had all started. There was Jesus, of course, and the year 0, but surely Adam and Eve would have had to have gotten a pretty good head start on him. Well, said the woman, who was leaning so far away from Maggie now the flight attendant was having trouble getting the beverage cart around her, I'd like to think they were created. She drew the word out like another woman might say, Manolo Blahnik. The world wore you out, Maggie thought, if you let it. Just that morning she had read that the Koch brothers were poised to buy the Chicago Tribune. She looked out the window. The Grand Canyon was a bright red gash below her. There was not one single cloud in the desert sky. The plane shuddered again and the pilot accelerated to a smoother altitude. There was a way, she thought, to open your heart to everyone, only Maggie hadn't found it yet. I don't have any problem with the word created, she said, and pulled up a photo of traditional Mongolian dance. This is 2. Baby is the new happy. The billboard said, breastfeeding. Let's talk about it. And the picture was of a corn-fed family, kids so indistinguishable from one another that Maggie couldn't count them all. Even though the billboard was so massive, the fat faces of the children 20 times life-sized, that she had at least 10 seconds viewing before her rent-a-Chevy Cruze passed by. The Cruze wouldn't let her go more than 75 miles an hour, and it wouldn't let her turn up the stereo past 35. It was okay to listen to Ashes of American Flags and Jesus, etc. at 35, but when it came to Heavy Metal Drummer or I Am Trying to Break Your Heart, you had to have 60 or 70 or whatever number she was being kept from by the Hertz safety police and the inventors of the My Key system for teenage-proofing cars. The next billboard said, "Baby is the new happy." It seemed, if possible, bigger than the last. In fact, Maggie was pretty sure she had never seen billboards this big in her entire life. And here came another one, a squirming newborn, this one with the caption, "I had hiccups before I was born." Somebody had dropped a lot of change out here in nowhere, Missouri. Was this the kind of thing the Koch brothers were up to these days? And who was their target audience exactly? Not the industrial farmers who seemed to be the only people living out here near the Kansas border, not the long-haul truckers all cranked up on Red Bull who didn't blink twice between the edge of the Rocky Mountains and the Mississippi River, and certainly not Maggie, who'd made a solemn promise to her 15-year-old self that she wouldn't ever have children and who had kept that promise, a decision that 10 years practicing clinical psychology on the team at Pelican Bay Maximum Security Prison confirmed over and over again. Now Maggie was 50, a consultant. Private practice had exhausted and depressed her in ways prison work never had, which is what found her on this mini tour talking to teams of young psychologists who'd gotten their first jobs in correctional institutions in 5 Midwestern states. Maggie, it turned out, liked working with the relatively mentally healthy, which was how she began all her seminars there, but by the grace of, you had to be careful with God in Missouri, Maggie thought, the crews slipping through the shadows of the largest billboards of all, set of 2, at the gates, what will you say to him if he asks, did you defend unborn children? Maggie sighed, tried for the millionth time to turn up the Wilco. How many of you got beat as a child? She had asked the auditorium full of freshly minted psychologists, PsyDs, and LSWs who sat before her in Jefferson City, startling them out of their post-latte lull. A few tentative hands, a few more, eventually the majority. They closed the walls in 2004, but this new facility was still pretty hardcore. How many of you were sexually abused? The Kansas border seemed to mark the end of the giant billboards. El Dorado was the next place she would light for 3 days. Maximum security, but not Supermax, which would be the next stop in Florence, Colorado. Ted Kaczynski's new digs. Not new, she thought, more than a decade now. She still remembered the Times photo, how groomed he'd look, how sexy. Her first thought, Harrison Ford will play him in the film. She was nearing the Flint Hills, the tall grass prairie, which would cheer her up after all that rectitude. It was late September, but in the creek bottoms, the cottonwoods were still vibrant green, and white clouds dotted an otherwise cornflower sky. Rolling all 4 windows down, letting the wind toss her hair around, Maggie thought maybe it was the world's bright beauty that hurt her most of all. Look around you, she would tell the team in El Dorado after they'd put their hands in the air. Your father beat you with his belt. Your mother put her cigarette out on your forehead. Your father made you suck his dick in the shower every Saturday night from the time you were 9 until you turned 15 while your mother lay passed out drunk in the guest room. There would be a nod, a wince, some nervous laughter. You think that makes you special? Look around. A head shake, a grin. One guy might reach out to squeeze the shoulder of another. The answer is yes. However common your trauma, your pain is unique to you. And because of your pain, you are uniquely equipped to empathize with the pain of the men out in that yard whose struggle is not unrelated to your struggle. Their pain led them to make some bad choices, and your pain led you to them. Here's what Maggie learned in her decade at Pelican Bay. There was no bottom. No matter how spectacularly horrific a thing was done to one child, there was always another child who'd had it even worse. It seemed to be unlimited ownership, parenthood, a particular kind of no-holds-barred. The Chevy cruise was deep into the prairie now. Blue stem, verbena, timothy, rye, and the wind was making some ineffable thing of the grasses. Coneflowers, sunflower, prairie clover, blazing star. On a late September afternoon, it was possible that the Flint Hills were the most beautiful place on the planet. Another billboard loomed on the horizon, and Maggie braced herself. She had worked so hard to love the world rather than fear it. She did a pretty good job, but it took practice. It took practice every single day. Put more pressure on the corn earworm, the billboard said, and Maggie smiled, floated her arm out onto the hot slipstream. Fucking corn earworm, she said, grinning, and tried to turn up the Wilco one more time. 3. De-icing. Maggie looked out the window of the 9-seater turboprop into the swirling snow. When she had booked this flight online 3 days ago, it said there was only 1 seat left. Then the third spring storm in as many weeks had hit Boston. Her 8 companions, whoever they were, seemed to have come to their senses and stayed home. So it was only Maggie, who had chosen the seat behind the seat with the sign, "Co-pilot controls have been removed," and the large-headed pilot who was doing something that looked like his income taxes on his lap as they flew. Flying into a blizzard, Maggie thought, was not unlike driving into a blizzard. As you stared out the windshield, you got sucked into the whirlpool of snow until it felt like the plane was pitching over sideways. The snow had been wet and heavy when they took off from Logan, but here, 2,000 feet higher, the world was a crystalline snow globe, and they were hurtling through it towards Saranac Lake, New York. The good thing about working in a maximum security prison for 10 years, Maggie often heard herself saying, is that it taught you not to invent disaster. It taught you there was calamity everywhere, and if you happened to find yourself becalmed for a minute or an hour or a whole afternoon, it was best not to fill those moments with predictions of doom. Nevertheless, Maggie could not help noticing that what had been a very light coating of ice on the wing to her right was now not only thickening but spreading outward like cake frosting, covering the propeller housing, the little struts that held the wing to the plane, and what she could see of the nose. Look up, look up, look up, she thought at the pilot who was still shuffling papers on his lap. The plane shuddered out of the top of one cloud layer and entered another, and the pilot glanced at his navigation panel, twisted a knob a half turn to the right, and went back to the work on his lap. The last cloud had been white and silver, but this one had a distinctly black underbelly. The ice on the outside of the plane was getting thicker. On Valentine's Day, Maggie had been invited to a party where the caterer had pre-frozen a vodka bottle into a thick block of ice, and within the ice she had frozen the heads of several blood-red roses. Bored with the party, Maggie couldn't take her eyes off the bottle. She found it extremely beautiful and troubling, but she couldn't give the trouble a name. Vodka had been her mother's drink of choice, of course. A bottle a day at the end, and not $50 a throw kind either. But Maggie was sick to death of that being the reason for everything. The pilot cleared his throat, crossed out one figure, drew heavy circles around another with his pen. Now there was so much ice on the wing that tiny flecks of it were breaking off and hitting the body of the airplane, making skittering sounds like mice in the walls of an old cabin. Surely that will get his attention, Maggie thought, but if it did, it didn't show. Don't get old, her mother used to say to Maggie daily, as if anybody really had a choice in the matter, and then she'd sip on what she called a martini, which was really just crap vodka straight up, and she'd pop another Vioxx, eventually proving she was, in fact, the mistress of her own destiny. Hey, Maggie said now, louder than she'd intended, and the pilot, startled, swung his big head in her direction. She jerked her thumb at the ice-encased wing. That's not, right, is it? The pilot squinted out the window, rubbed his forehead with 2 fingers, said, "The plane is equipped with heaters that are supposed to help the wing shed ice." He shrugged. But if the storm's too bad, the equipment can't keep up. He looked back down at his papers. She watched the side of his face while he considered and then decided to be one human being in the presence of another. I had to make a decision a few minutes ago whether to turn back or go forward, he said. Now our best shot is to try to make Saranac. If I drop her down fast enough, it should pop the ice right off. Maggie sat back in her chair. Thanks for telling me, she said, closing her eyes. What was more important, maybe, than whether you lived or died, was that you didn't do it in isolation. That was why solitary was still the punishment the prisoners most respected. It's the worst kind of torture, a serial rapist doing life in Pelican Bay had told her. I'd rather be beaten or burned. The pilot formed his papers into a neat little stack and tucked them under his seat. He twirled a few knobs on the dashboard and pushed the control yoke hard forward. The plane pitched sharply downward, and in seconds they were out of the black and back into the silver. Maggie's ears popped. Here's where we test my theory, the pilot said, grinning, a little hangdog now, leaning forward in his chair just as Maggie caught the briefest flash of pine trees and mountainside through a tiny sucker hole below. We're all right, Maggie said, leaning forward too, as if the pitch of her weight might help the plane descend a little faster. And together, they waited for the ice to explode from the wings and release them. Thank you. I'll just read a little bit from my last book, Contents May Have Shifted. We'll go from airplane story to airplane story. Okay. This is Delta 55. The plane is gradually but perceptibly descending. It is barely light outside, and we aren't due at Orly until nearly noon. There's an odd ticking noise coming from the wing outside my window. I come fully awake and realize we are listing strenuously to the right. I glance at my seatmate on the aisle. Her name is Rebecca. She is a 26-year-old bank teller from Cincinnati who has never flown before, who has saved for 5 years to take her dream trip to Paris. I spent most of dinner telling her how much safer airplanes are than car travel, how the 777 has a minimum of 3 fail-safes on each of its major systems, how even if one of the engines fell clean off the fuselage, it is designed to tumble backwards up and over the wing so it doesn't tear the wing from the plane. Now, in spite of all my reassurances, we seem to be heading shoulder first into the North Atlantic. Ladies and gentlemen, the pilot says, as many of you are probably aware, we are descending, preparing to make an unscheduled landing into Reykjavik, Iceland. Approximately 35 minutes ago, we experienced an explosion in our number 2 engine, and that engine is now inoperable. The ticking sound you hear is the wind running through it, spinning the blades backwards, much like a household fan. You can probably also tell that we are tacking toward Iceland as we would in a sailboat, as our current engine configuration will not give us full power in a straight line. Now Rebecca is awake and looking at me wild-eyed. The man likes a metaphor, I say, and offer a small smile. The light out the window has strengthened, and I can see white caps on an angry gray sea. I always kind of wanted to go to Iceland, I say, but by now Rebecca is no longer looking at me. She has her eyes closed tightly, has given herself, I imagine, to prayer. We will be landing in approximately 15 minutes, the captain says. Please give your undivided attention to the flight attendants as they instruct you in landing in the brace position. I like that he did not say crash. I like that he's a language guy. The ocean is getting quite a bit closer, no sign of Iceland out my window, and I hope that Reykjavik Airport does not turn out to be a metaphor for fucked. Just when it seems that our wheels have to be skimming the water, land and runway lights appear. And then more of them. So many lights, it is hard to count them. A sea of spinning red and blue. Every ambulance and fire truck in Iceland seems to have come out to greet us. Holy shit, I say, just before the wheels hit the foam, and the foam splashes up and covers all the windows, throwing the cabin in a half-light, exactly like waking up in a tent after a snowstorm, and then everyone is cheering as the plane glides to a jerky, sticky stop. Much later, in an upstairs blank space of terminal, as we are being fed rice with some kind of yellow, chickeny goo all over it by something resembling the Icelandic Red Cross, the crew tells us the reason for the emergency equipment. When the number 2 engine exploded, it spit jet fuel all over the fuselage. We were a Molotov cocktail hurtling through space, is the way the literary pilot puts it. There was no way to be certain that the friction of the tires on the runway wouldn't make a spark and ignite us, turn us into a 90-mile-per-hour ball of flame. This book is told in 144 parts, small parts that seem unrelated but add up, in my opinion. This is another one. This is 31 Mount Shasta, California. Carmen gives me valor in a bottle. She says her mother has a special word for men like Ethan, and I think it's going to be something magical in Latin, but the word turns out to be freeloader. And even though we have only just met, we drive up as far as the snow will allow us and shout what we want in a man at the mountain. My list has stuff like loves many things and wants to have fun and generous with time, money, spirit. And Carmen starts with compassion and ends with self-love that is not self-absorption. While we are at it, we shout things we want besides a man. And I say, a teaching job in Colorado, less back pain, and a trip to Antarctica. And she says, a walk-in closet, a half-ton pickup, and a babysitter I can trust. Later, at a bar full of guys in Carhartts with Saturate before using on the stereo, we meet up with 2 women who have both just returned from Burning Man. Ava, who wants to be beautiful and to stop eating fruit, calls Burning Man the 4 worst days of her life. It made her heart hurt, she says, all those people looking to fill a bottomless need. Sasha says it was the 4 most important days of her life, though both Carmen and I find her descriptions of the festival far more terrifying than Ava's. Then we go home and watch the Dixie Chicks movie twice all the way through without stopping. I check my voicemail and Cinder has left a little song on it that goes, how do you solve a problem like Fatima? Fatima is one of Ethan's other girlfriends. And Nora has left a message that says, I think Ethan missed out on a few of the simple things, like mercy. And Practical Karen has left one that says, swear to God, if he isn't out of there by the end of spring break, I'm driving up and we're going to the Target and getting a whole bunch of those big blue plastic containers and all his shit's going out on the curb. And I know they're all trying to help me, but seriously, after 4 solid hours of shut up and sing, Ethan couldn't re-engage my attention if he brought Harrison Ford home for a threesome. There's a little Harrison Ford connection. At Crystal Lake the next morning, under the shadow of that giant white she-mountain, it is just a little too easy to tell Ava why she ought to stop dating the alcoholic. On the peak, the wind is blowing up frozen clouds in the shape of Armageddon, though it is still as a church where we are standing, and warm. I say, I don't know, I'm just feeling so... Say it, Carmen says. Say it. Powerful. I had been trying to decide between directionless and untethered. Powerful, I say, just as the wind reaches the surface of the lake. This is Tucson, Arizona. I have not been on the property 30 minutes when I am lying on a massage table in a softly lit frangipani scented room with a person named Trevor towering over me. I can see, Trevor says, that you are doing a lot of spiritual work because look how far you are out in your hair. His accent is vaguely South African and he has the most impressive unibrow I have ever seen. I do not read poetry, Trevor says, because I live poetry. He picks my feet up and lets them fall back to the table. May I ask you, he says, why the lower half of your body is perpetually standing in ice-cold water? He means energetically, of course, because the room is warm and my legs are dry. And what happened here, he asks, not waiting for an answer. He has his hand on my leg at the exact place where, when I was 4 years old, my father threw me so hard against a big oak wardrobe that I broke my femur. The bone healed 40 years ago. I was casted from the tip of my toes to my armpits for months. But Trevor is not the first healer to be able to see what happened. My father, I begin. I am not afraid of your pain, Trevor says. I am not afraid of your grief. I am not afraid of your terror. You want to know why I'm not afraid of your terror? I nod. I am not afraid of your terror because I have gone inside the monster, and inside the monster is pure wonder. Somewhere in this building, my friend Willow, who I have come to Canyon Ranch with, is getting a nice, simple lavender scrub and an herbal wrap. Willow looked through the catalog, thought, yeah, the first night, maybe a nice herbal wrap after all that travel. Pamela, Trevor says, will you tell me your father's name so that I may ask him to excuse himself from the lower half of your body? Yes, I say, and I do. Sebastian, Trevor says, Sebastian, you must get out of there. Sebastian, he says, it does not belong to you. He has his eyes closed and his hands tight around my ankles. No, Sebastian, he says more forcefully now, there are no options. You stay like that for an excruciating amount of time. Then he folds my hands across my chest and covers them with his. If you could have only one thing, he says, would you choose peace or ecstasy? Ecstasy, I think, though I'm pretty sure I'm supposed to say peace. Peace is an illusion, Trevor says. I am in the ecstasy nearly all the time now, even when I sleep. I think of the composer's lonely bedroom, the terrible black sheets, clock radio projecting blood-red digits onto the ceiling, his bald head a glinting Cabernet color like someone already dead. Pamela, Trevor says, slapping the bottom of my feet with his palms. Yes, sir, I say, out of habit. He's got my wrists now, is stretching them back over my head. No one has ever called me Pamela except my father. You have two glasses, Trevor says. One is completely full and one is completely empty. In which glass is stillness possible? Full one, I say. Questions are getting easier. Trevor now has his powerful thumbs wrapped almost completely around my uppermost vertebra. You can get to stillness through ecstasy, he says, but you can't get to ecstasy through stillness. Think about all the ways the language of the New Age is custom-made for terrorism. I think about when a pink mouth opened in a white sky over Davis and I saw for the second time the cupped waiting hands. When one of the doing lines in your life intersects with the circle of your now, Trevor says, what happens? It has to bend, I say, confident. It bends and eventually becomes a circle. Precisely, he says, and releases his death grip on my neck. Just a couple more. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Driving from Chicago in the -6-degree weather, neck craned out the window looking for the lunar eclipse because the rocket scientists told me to, but the light pollution extends all the way to the Wisconsin border, and I think I'm probably facing the wrong direction anyhow. If I became the rocket scientist's girlfriend, that fortune cookie about me being the reasonable one would never, ever, ever be true. In Milwaukee, everything is frozen solid. The river, the stoplights, even my car door. But when I get to my high-rise hotel room, there's the eclipse right out my window, halfway over and looking strange enough to scare a caveman or an ancient Egyptian to death. Trish comes to meet me for breakfast with her sperm bank in vitro baby, and I have no idea how to respond as she details all the ways her life has become a living hell. She knows I thought she was crazy to do it at her age alone with her 80-hour-a-week job, and now here she is as if to prove me wrong, but everything she says makes her life sound 10 times worse than I could have imagined. The lake is frozen as far out as you can see, blocks of ice heaved up on the shore like wrecked cars, and Cliff Parker, whose law firm is sponsoring my visit, picks me up and takes me to the Milwaukee Country Club for lunch. It is so much like the country club in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania that my father could just barely afford to belong to. It takes my breath away. Only it is like it is still 1972 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The white wallpaper with little parasol-toting maidens doing tourgetés across it. The 4 dead gray-haired ladies propped up in the corner as if to look like they're playing bridge. The place probably seats 250, not even counting the no women allowed grill downstairs, and yet other than the dead ladies in the corner, we are the only ones eating today. The point of this luncheon, I quickly understand, is so that Cliff can show me why he is a lawyer and not a writer, to show me the kind of life he gave up writing for. He has invited 8 people to the luncheon besides the 2 of us, and exactly none of them show up. I can't decide if Cliff Parker is a sociopath or just so completely normal that he's incomprehensible to me. Our waitress is actually named Trudy. She has a beehive hairdo and is at least 114 years old. We both order the Cobb salad, and for some inexplicable reason, it takes 45 minutes to arrive. The room is being heated to a sultry 85 degrees, and there is a squirrel hurling himself repeatedly at the floor-to-ceiling window behind Cliff's head. Over and over, he climbs the nearest tree and then flies, flying squirrel style, and lands splat with his face against the window where his paws achieve suction for a little more than 1 second before he slides like a cartoon character down to the bottom of the glass. He does this 5 or 6 times before I comment on it, though it makes such a terrible noise every time he hits. I can't believe Cliff doesn't turn around. Probably rabid, Cliff says with a casual wave of his hand, and I feel my eyebrows go up, and he says, a lot of the squirrels around here are. This is 80, Portland, Oregon. Rick says, Pam, if everyone deserved a down pillow, there wouldn't be any more birds. This is 111, Trenton, New Jersey. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that my back hurt so much because when I was 4 and in my 3/4 body cast, my mother found it easiest to carry me around upside down like a monkey, using the plaster bar the doctors had fashioned between my knees to keep them for 3.5 months the correct distance apart. And let's say she did just that, until my second to last appointment when the orthopedic surgeon said, you haven't been carrying her around by this bar, have you? And my mother shot one quick glance at my father and said, of course not, no. And it became a funny story the 2 of them liked to tell together to friends over a couple of beers. And let's say that when their friends asked, as of course they would, how in the name of heaven a 4-year-old breaks her femur, they said that I had somehow managed to pull the giant wardrobe over onto myself. Except instead of wardrobe, they would have said credenza, because it would have made us sound richer than we were. I still don't see how it would make me feel any better to think of the pain in my hip and spine as anything other than my most loyal and valuable companion. The continuous non-voice in my ear that says, you got out alive and you still get to go. No 2 people who have ever lived loved to travel more than my mother and father. They gave that love in their fashion to me. And I will end with Istanbul. At the Sultan's Palace, beautiful long-limbed girl, sexy but not too sexy, lots of brassy hair, surrounded by 7 or 8 international travelers her age. To an Australian boy with acne scars, she says, you are walking through the Topkapi Palace with 3 beautiful women. What more do you want? The other young women are not in the same room of beautiful as she, but they accept the compliment. Don't dare to interrupt. The boy says, maybe if you were all naked, and laughs. One of the other girls, a Swede, says, no, meaning, go fuck yourself, acting first. The brassy-haired girl holds her fingers to the Swede's lips, says, my parents taught me never to say no immediately. To men? The Swede asks. To anything, she said. Istanbul is the only major city in the world that is situated on 2 continents. Since 330 AD, it has been the capital of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Latin Empire, and as recently as 1922, the Ottoman Empire. In the hilly streets, ruin leans into palace, leans into internet cafe. We are in line waiting to get into the harem. Miles of tiled, low-lit corridors and rooms so thick with ghosts of women in captivity you can feel their hair on your arm, their jasmine-scented breath on your face. In the Blue Mosque, there are 250,000 tiles the color of sky. When the sun comes out, inside is sky and outside is golden. I am 46 years old and ashamed of the fact that this is the first mosque of my life, but later, when the evening call to prayer catches me in the garden between the Blue Mosque and the Hagia Sophia, call and echo, echo and answer, bouncing off domes and turrets that have stood on this hill for 1,500 years, I know faith springs out of doubt like topsoil, and one thing I am is here right now. Across the Golden Horn, where the Bosphorus meets the Sea of Marmara, the Asian part of the city glistens in the twilight. As a candidate for the center of everything, Istanbul beats Pueblo, Colorado, hands down. The gulls are turning cartwheels around the towers of the Blue Mosque and cawing like crazy women. Byzantium, I say to them. Constantinople. The circle of my now is wreaking havoc with the lines of my doom. I am learning to say yes, if not always immediately. A sweet-faced Turkish boy, maybe 19, offers me a Kleenex, puts both hands over his heart when I take it, says I look just like his mother, and I cry.
You've been listening to On the Block Radio with Andrew Gurovich. The show is produced in Portland, Oregon by Michael DiNapoli at MD Productions. Theme music by Moving the Mountain. Closing music by Jonathan Oak. Look us up on the web at ontheblockradio.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Don't forget to tune in next week for a brand new episode. Previous episodes can be found on our website. Thanks for listening.
Oh, you're beautiful kitty kitties. Oh, look at you out there. Beauty like a bolt, light in a darkened hallway. New minds, looking at this world, at our lives, with the perspective of apocalypse children. Standing dusty in the barren highways, standing broken before the fathers who were meant to make us whole, but who only lied to us about what it meant to be a man, about what it meant to be a woman, about what it meant to be a child of this doomed